morning, everyone, or afternoon or evening, depending where you're joining from. My name is Bianca, and I'm part of the BD and marketing team. Just a few some housekeeping before we start the event. We will be recording this webinar and we will post it on YouTube channel. So if you want to share it afterwards, you can go and see it there. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A box and we will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. We are hosting this webinar as part of the World Green Building Week. For those who don't know what this is, World Green Building Week is part of World Green Building Council's annual campaign that empowers us all to deliver greener buildings. This year's theme is to act on climate by calling the building sector, policymakers and governments to take urgent action to deliver net zero buildings. Today's speakers are Paul Kenyon, who will kickstart the webinar. He's the managing partner for Manchester office, and Simon Wyatt, who is our sustainability partner. He will take us through the main presentation. Paul, do you want to take it over?
Thanks very much, Bianca. Good morning to everyone that's joined the call today. Today is the third day of World Green Building Week, and we're delighted to host this presentation. It's a very topical subject and one that's dear to all of our hearts. Cundall are committed to achieving excellence in this field, and we became the first carbon neutral consultancy and the first One Planet company. We have circa 950 people and 25 global offices. We're all committed to providing sustainable solutions to our clients. The presentation is being carried out throughout Green Building Week in several of our office locations, and although this is a new virtual world, you could be joining from any part of the globe. The discussion today is primarily aimed at the Manchester professional community. So we need all of our built environment disciplines to collaborate to address the climate emergency. And while Cundall offer a multidisciplinary engineering consultancy, we do achieve the best outcomes when we collaborate strongly with like-minded architects, quantity surveyors, agents, etc. The climate emergency requires action across all sectors. No sector is exempt from having to address their environmental footprint. And we're increasingly finding opportunities to do this in all of our sectors. Lots of clients are pushing for net zero carbon now. So just a reminder, what is the climate emergency? I don't know if you saw the BBC documentary last week on extinction, but David Attenborough said that while habitat reduction is the most urgent issue to address, most scientists agree that the climate change is the greater long-term challenge. So we're currently on a trajectory for at least a 3-degree global temperature rise, well above the targets and aspirations of the Paris Agreement, which will have a profound impact on us all. It's therefore vital that we act now and act fast in the hope of alleviating the worst of the predicted outcomes. And in order to achieve reduction on this scale, we need complete societal transformation to flatten the emission curves and allow our ecosystem to cope. So achieving net zero carbon must be at the heart of our industry's response to the crisis. And over the past couple of years, we've seen the impact of climate change for ourselves as the weather becomes more severe and widespread, from the recent forest fires and bushfires in America, Southern Europe and Australia to the flooding that we saw in the UK back in February. The evidence is here for us all to see. So what are the drivers for change? What will make us change? At the most basic level, the government regulation will drive us to improve our game. The UK Parliament, having declared a climate emergency and amended the Climate Change Act, committing the UK in June 2019 to reaching net zero carbon by 2050. And previously, we only had to achieve 80% of this. But unfortunately, only a month later, in July 2019, the Committee for Climate Change reported that we were already falling short of the 80% target, implying that it'll be very, very difficult to achieve net zero by 2050. The second sort of drivers for change is through local authorities. Most major UK cities have now declared that they'll be carbon neutral well in advance of the 2050 target. And part of the attraction of cities is that bold climate action can deliver many benefits, such as better health and well-being, improved air quality, economic savings for individuals and businesses, new jobs, less congestion on roads, and cleaner and greener places. Interestingly, the councils that have spent the most time researching the extent of the challenge ahead have set less ambitious targets, with Manchester set to become net zero carbon by 2038, whilst others believe it will be possible in the next 5 years. Rather unrealistic, probably. Finally, we find the drive to change can be found with investors, developers and occupants themselves. And it's been great to see a swathe of new UK sign-ups to the World Green Building Council's net zero carbon building commitment, which include Argent, Bruntwood, Granger and Grosvenor. But perhaps I think the greatest driver will come from funders, with the likes of the world's largest investor, BlackRock, recently announcing that they will actively avoid any carbon-intensive investments in future. And so the funding for poor carbon performing buildings simply may not be available in the future. So now let us turn to the climate triage. I'd like to introduce Simon Wyatt. Simon is a partner in our business and has led our sustainability team for over 15 years. He's currently working with Muse as their sustainability champion in New Bailey in Manchester, and he's helped to deliver our design for performance work for Ask Real Estate and First Street, to name a few. Simon's passionate about delivering low and zero carbon buildings and then working with clients to achieve their targets, whilst appreciating both the impact commercially on projects as well as not to jeopardise the occupants' comfort and well-being. So over to you, Simon.
Thanks, Paul, and good morning, everyone. So why is this important to the built environment? Well, the built environment is generally considered to be responsible for up to 40% of CO2 emissions in Europe, 11% of which are from the actual construction of the building and almost 30% from its day-to-day operation over the life of the building. So over the last couple of years, there's been a real push from the World Green Building Council on their programme Advancing Net Zero Carbon, where they've set a roadmap towards net zero carbon buildings, with new buildings becoming net zero carbon by 2030 and existing buildings becoming net zero carbon in operation by 2050. And then by 2050, all new buildings are also considering whole life carbon, which includes embodied carbon. To aid this process, they've released a number of documents explaining their approach to net zero carbon and how to do carbon assessments, including embodied carbon reviews, which we've helped them produce. This is a really good starting point, and it's now being taken on by the local green building councils, including the UKGBC, who have put together a really comprehensive framework for the UK on how we actually deliver net zero carbon buildings. So the framework which the UKGBC have come up with is as shown on the screen, which is reduce construction impacts, reduce operational energy use, use renewables on site where possible, and if not via purchase agreements. Then only once you've reduced the energy as much as possible on site can you use offsets to remove any residual carbon emissions. What's really important with this is public disclosure and transparency. So we need to make sure that we can hold people to account on their claims. So all data must be published on an annual basis so that it can be reviewed. And what's really important, and what I'll go through in a little bit of detail now, is the first two. So when this framework originally came out, a number of developers offset the carbon emissions from their energy intensity building and claim to be net zero carbon. In order to close this loophole, the UKGBC and other organisations are starting to put intensity targets around the construction impact and operation energy. So what they're saying is, in order to claim to be net zero carbon, you must hit an absolute energy performance, an absolute upfront embodied carbon, and then only then can you offset and claim to be net zero carbon. And those are going to be challenging targets. But the question is, how do you set an energy intensity target for net zero carbon? Well, the way that the UKGBC and LETI have done this is to basically go through and look at the UK and say, what is a net zero carbon economy? And a net zero carbon economy is one where our energy demands are met for 100% from renewable sources. And at the moment, we consume considerably more electricity than we're able to produce from renewables. In order to move towards or transition to a net zero carbon economy, we must reduce our demand at the same time as increasing our capacity for renewables. And only when the two meet can we claim to be a net zero carbon economy. So if we look at the current state of play, down here is the blue bar where we're producing renewable energy, and up here is the purple bar, which is our demand. And in order to be a net zero carbon economy, we must reduce our demand at the same time as increasing consumption. And when the two meet, we transition to a net zero carbon economy. That generally indicates that we need to reduce our demand on electricity by about 50 to 60%. This is going to be challenging as we move to electrify vehicles and buildings, and aviation and other sectors are going to be more difficult to decarbonise. So the built environment, if we want to set a net zero carbon operational target from a top-down approach using Paris-proof methodology, then we kind of look towards this kind of 60 to 70% reduction in operational energy. At the same time as looking at this from a top-down approach, we can also look at it from a bottom-up approach. And this is what the London Energy Transformation Initiative did, which was a group of volunteers who've been looking at net zero carbon across the industry. And they modelled a good practice building, which achieved an energy intensity of around about 160 kilowatt hours per metre squared, which is fairly good in today's market. Most buildings are up over 200. And then they applied even more stringent design criteria and measures. And they worked out that if they applied pretty much everything they could think of, they could get energy consumption down to around about 55 kilowatt hours per metre squared. And that's a number you'll hear quite a lot when you're talking about net zero carbon. It's listed in the UKGBC, the LETI, the RIBA challenge guidance as the target for commercial developments. There are also targets for schools and residential, and more targets are being developed at the moment. And this is being done across the world by all the green building councils. So there's cross-reference to see how other sectors and other areas are moving towards net zero carbon. As we decarbonise operational energy, it means that the importance of embodied carbon will increase over time. All emissions will fall over time, but the proportion of a building's carbon footprint will obviously move more towards the upfront embodied carbon associated with its construction. When we talk about embodied carbon, what we mean is all of the carbon that's associated with the construction, operation and deconstruction of a building. And we use the term upfront embodied carbon to cover from the process, extraction, materials, transportation to site, and the site activities up to practical completion. That is the upfront embodied carbon, and that can be reported for any building on completion. Then the operational carbon is for things like maintenance, refurbishment, repair, which should be reported on an annual basis along with the operational energy. And then at the end of the life, when a building's deconstructed, we need to consider the carbon emissions associated with the material disposal and hopefully reuse as we move towards a more circular economy. As well as operational energy intensity targets, the industry is looking to set carbon intensity for upfront embodied carbon and whole life carbon. Cundall worked with the GLA recently to help set their methodology for doing embodied carbon and whole life carbon assessments, and we're speaking to Manchester Council at the moment to do something similar. When we reviewed over 50 buildings which had recently been built in London, which had done whole life carbon assessments, the average upfront embodied carbon intensity was over 1,000 kilograms of CO2 per metre squared. The GLA aren't setting targets, and nor Manchester for this yet. They're just having a requirement for doing an assessment, but they are giving benchmarks, and the GLA benchmark at the moment is 900, which is a small reduction. But LETI and other institutes are going much harder, and they're pushing for targets of 600 and then eventually down to 350, which is kind of a 60 to 70% reduction in embodied carbon, which is in line with the World GBC recommendations and report. This is extremely challenging. As you can see from these examples here, there's almost no buildings achieving that kind of level, and the two that are on the left-hand side, which are achieving the LETI 2030 target, are heavy refurbishment projects, not new build. So over the last 6 months, we've seen a whole raft of intensity targets come out for operational energy, embodied carbon, and whole life carbon. What's good is they are aligning as more and more data comes available. A lot of design teams are challenging them at the moment and seeing how they can work towards them, and the feedback is being used to revise these targets. But they are challenging, and that's the idea of them, to challenge the industry to work as hard as possible. With all the frameworks that we've seen released over the last year, Cundall have kind of pulled together the best of what we've seen into what we call our steps to net zero carbon, which we apply to both new buildings and existing buildings. So starting with passive design optimization, removing fossil fuels, using renewables, considering upfront and whole life carbon, and then really focusing on that public disclosure and reporting piece so that we have that transparency so that we can see what's going on in the market going forward. But what's been interesting is, as Paul alluded to, we are in a climate emergency. And when healthcare professionals and disaster relief professionals turn up to an emergency, what they use is a triage methodology to assess where to focus their activity. So when they turn up to an accident, they basically try and prioritize who to treat. And generally, the easiest people to treat and the ones that demand the most attention are normally the walking wounded, the ones that are running around screaming or making the most noise, whereas we should be concentrating on the people who aren't making noise or are looking in trouble. And if we turn that into the built environment, the walking wounded are the new building. For the last year, we've really just focused on new buildings. The entire frameworks are geared towards new building. All standards are talking about new buildings, and the industry is generally only discussing new buildings. But if we think about the 2050 target, 70 to 80% of buildings which will be operating in 2050 already are built now. We only replace 1% of the building stock a year. So with new buildings, we will not hit the target alone. We really need to concentrate on those existing buildings. And what we need to do is have a methodology for reviewing existing buildings to decide where to focus our time and effort. With new buildings, you generally have a budget, and it should be a fairly straightforward process to achieving net zero carbon. Where the difficulty will lie will be existing buildings where there isn't much money available, and there are sitting tenants, and the building has to be maintained in operation. So there's some real challenges around existing buildings. We also have to acknowledge that some buildings might be beyond saving, and they won't be around in 2050. So we don't want to waste resources and time on those buildings. We want to focus on the buildings which we think have a chance of having a long and prosperous life. So where to start? Well, over the last 6 months, Cundall have been working with a number of clients to look at their carbon footprint and portfolios. And what we've realized is that we need to look at it kind of at 3 levels, which is obviously the building and asset level, which is easy enough to do. We have the standards for. But again, in order to prioritize, we don't want to look at just the individual assets. We want to look at a portfolio and a state of properties and work out where the resources should be spent, where the time and effort and money should be going to. But in order to do that, first and foremost, we must look at a corporation in its entirety to really understand its carbon footprint. And we're working with a number of organisations to do carbon footprinting of their organisations, setting science-based targets to align with the Paris agreements, and then driving that through their real estate and into their portfolios. So it's really a top-down approach from understanding your footprint to taking action. And as part of this process, we can actually look to certification. So you can make anything carbon neutral certified. So as Paul mentioned earlier, we're just finalising our carbon certification for Cundall across all 3 scopes. And we should hopefully be a net zero carbon business by the end of the month. But you can have a net zero carbon certified building. You can have events. We've recently certified a TEDx event. Products, organizations is the main one that's certified. And you can also do districts, cities. The C40 program is looking to decarbonize cities. So we can look to certify against any of these things if required. In order to look to certification and understanding the footprint, the process is fairly simple at corporate level. So it's understanding and calculating your carbon footprint against all three scopes, reducing your carbon footprint as much as possible with an action plan, and then offsetting any residual carbon with ideally co-benefit offsets. And then the final process is that annual reporting and transparency piece. You often hear when we talk about carbon about scope 1, 2, 3, and it's generally quite confusing and not everyone kind of understands it. So we'll just give a quick recap of what we actually mean by different scopes and how they apply in the built environment. So scope 1 is fairly easy to understand. Those are basically your direct burn of fossil fuels. So if you have a building and you have gas boilers or diesel generators, those are scope 1 emissions. If you have fleets of vehicles which use diesel or petrol, then they're scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 emissions are associated with your direct use of energy within buildings. So that is electricity. If you're connected to district heating or cooling systems, they're included in your scope 2, but 99% of the time it's just your electricity that you buy. And then scope 3 is the complicated area. So a lot of people, when they talk about being carbon neutral or looking at their carbon footprint, generally only consider scope 1 and 2. Scope 3 is much more complicated because it's the indirect supply chain impacts. And they're both upstream, so when you procure and build things, and downstream when you sell and use things. And what we do with quite a lot of our clients is when we're looking at corporate level, we cover all of scope 3, which includes things like business travel and commuting. But when we're looking at a property portfolio, we start to remove things which aren't applicable to the built environment. So things like the commuting, the sold goods, and the franchises. There is a methodology in the industry which we help put together for the built environment, which is the RICS whole life carbon methodology, which covers about 90 to 95% of the things we've gone through. And it's a really good starting point for reviewing scope 3 emissions and whole life carbon in the built environment. Just be mindful it doesn't cover absolutely everything. So if you are doing corporate reporting, there are a few additional things you will need to add into that metric. And that covers emissions kind of at 3 levels. So again, we've got the upfront embodied carbon associated with the building, which can be reported on practical completion. Then we have the in-use, which should be reported against each module on an annual basis, and then the end of life and reuse of materials. So what we look to do with quite a lot of our clients is set science-based targets for their entire operation, and that obviously will have to cover their real estate. So what absolute percentage reduction from the scope 1 and 2 emissions do we need to achieve from their building stock and their new buildings, and then translate that into intensity targets for the different building types using science-based targets as a driver, and then comparing those against things like the LETI, the UKGBC and the RIBA targets. Then it's fundamental to go into your actual buildings and start understanding what the actual energy consumption of those buildings is. So doing energy audits to get information on both landlord and tenant energy. If there is a split, if it's owner occupied, then just looking at the overall energy intensity. A good way to do this is using the Australian Neighbours Scheme. This is being brought over to the UK by the Building Better Partnerships as part of the Design Performance Standard, but at the moment it's very easy to just use the Australian scheme. The Australian scheme was introduced over a decade ago and has reduced energy consumption in buildings by about 70% in Australia, which is really impressive. And they have a 6-star system, where 6 stars is basically equivalent to our net zero carbon targets. We've been working with a few major portfolio owners to assess their buildings, and in the UK we're finding that the average stock isn't really achieving very highly on the Neighbours scheme at the moment, as you would expect, because we haven't been designing to it. They're generally achieving less than 1 star on most instances. When we start to collate all this data and carbon data, you can quickly use algorithms and machine learning to highlight quick wins and easy wins. So this was a project we did with Newcastle Council to look at all their buildings. We just used fairly high level data, so a lot around EPCs, but we're able to mine the data to see where there were quick wins. For example, looking at the lighting efficiencies, and we could quickly target the buildings which hadn't upgraded to LED and set an LED program in place. Also looking at things like air permeability. So most of the buildings that the council owned hadn't had air pressure tests, so commissioning air pressure tests and doing remedial works was quite a quick and easy win for those types of buildings. We also can use the data to prioritize actions and cluster actions together. So where we want to be converting to air source heat pumps and removing fossil fuels, we can target a number of buildings and try and procure work in a package. So we're not just doing a one-off project which has a cost. We're looking to do 10 or 20 buildings as one commission. So it becomes considerably cheaper for the client to move forward on that arrangement. What's also useful is looking for outliers. So when we have a lot of data, building types will be clustered together, but you're always going to get buildings which don't perform as well or perform much better. And where we have buildings which perform much better, we can use the lessons learned from that building to apply to the greater stock. And where we have poor performing buildings, we can either target that for quick wins, or we can realize that the building is probably a write-off and needs to be considered for redevelopment or redeployment somewhere else. Once we understand what's going on at portfolio and corporate level, then we can really start looking at individual buildings. So where you have a large portfolio, you might want to target 4 or 5 example buildings to use as prototypes to inform the decision making. If you've only got a few buildings, then you can just do analysis on those buildings themselves. And we offer at Cundall basically 2 levels of review. So we do high-level asset reviews, which are roughly in line with ASHRAE level 2 energy audits. So that is looking at the energy consumption of the building, comparing it to the benchmarks and LETI targets, and then using our 7 steps to do a review of what we consider to be net zero carbon. So for each of these 7 steps, we'll have 10 or 20 individual components. So for passive design, things like access to daylight, natural ventilation, insulation levels, air permeability, which will score against the net zero carbon criteria. And then we can give an overall score for that step and say how close it is to net zero carbon, and then give recommendations how it can be moved closer towards the net zero carbon target. So it's a very high level review. It can be done fairly quick and easy, but what it won't give you is a pathway down to the intensity targets we discussed earlier. And we can use that for any type of building. We've been using it quite extensively recently with the Department for Education on schools and looking at their Gen Zero schools project, which we'll do separate seminars on later, which are looking at how we can get net zero schools, and that's really focusing on passive design and how we can reduce energy consumption. Residential, especially high-rise residential, is a major challenge, looking at how we can re-insulate and reduce energy consumption. Whereas light industrial is an interesting one, because if we use our 7 steps, most of these buildings have brick walls and crinkly tin roofs, so they're poorly insulated, but there's no point investing in insulation in these buildings, because 80 to 90% of their load is process load. So we really want to engage with the tenants and occupants to reduce their process load rather than spend resource and carbon insulating the buildings for little benefit. And then probably one of the biggest challenges is commercial buildings in city centres. So if you think about a lot of dense urban environments, you're going to have a lot of buildings which are sealed, fully glazed, energy intensive, and in order to decarbonise them, there's going to be significant facade works required and potentially recladding associated with those works. Again, we can highlight all of this without doing any detailed analysis. We can just use the 7 steps as a guidance for how we actually go about that. What we also have been doing for a number of clients is doing detailed level 3 energy audits to ASHRAE standards. This is basically where we go in, we get a full energy audit using as much sub-metering as possible to understand the energy consumption of the building, and then we build a fully calibrated digital twin of that building to get the same performance, and then we can apply parametric modelling and run a number of optioneering activities in order to produce a pathway down to net zero carbon. So introducing things like heat pumps, improving the fabric, moving towards mixed mode ventilation using natural ventilation, and then looking at behaviour change. And then we can kind of map that out on the design and show how we can move towards those intensity targets we were talking about earlier. What's interesting with most existing buildings, especially commercial, is they have sitting tenants, they have existing plants, they've got facade replacement plans already in place. So it's how we factor our net zero carbon pathway into that. Most buildings, you can't just go in and take possession and do the works. You need to wait till the leases run out and you can take possession of certain floors. So the work has to be phased over a period of time, and that will dictate when the building achieves net zero carbon. So for the building I showed on the previous slide, their aim was by 2030, but they didn't have a major break in their lease clauses till 2034. So that was the earliest we believe that we can get them to net zero carbon, because they need to do significant work on those floors. So I'll just finish up with some quick wins and key considerations. So the quick wins are things we can do to any building. You can just go in and make significant improvements in energy efficiency, probably 20–30% improvement. The key considerations are things which are going to take a lot more time and effort, but probably need to be considered for most buildings in order to get them down to the intensity targets. So for example, fairly easy quick wins is going in and replacing existing lighting with LED lighting. Sounds very simple, it is. Also controls with photocell and absence detection. Another major quick win we've seen is just changing set points and controls. So a lot of buildings will heat and cool to 22 degrees, which means they'll be simultaneously heating and cooling in different zones. They'll have competing equipment trying to heat and cool at the same time, and they're just generally wasting a lot of energy. Whereas if we move those heating and cooling set points apart, it means that we get less hunting and the systems are able to operate much more efficiently. So heating to 20 degrees, cooling to 24 degrees, or even up to 26 degrees. Turning off plant out of hours. One of the things we're looking at with lots of net zero carbon buildings at the moment is having openable windows. You might not use them during operation, but most buildings use a lot of energy for out of hours usage when you've got 2 or 3 people in the building, but they're still using the cooling plant and mechanical ventilation because the windows are non-openable. So just installing openable windows will enable you to not have to run the plant out of hours. Whereas the key considerations are kind of the stuff we've gone through before, but they're really looking at the facade, facade replacement, reducing glazing areas to achieve better optimization of daylighting, using mixed mode ventilation for significant periods of the time, phasing out fossil fuels, which is one of the biggest challenges. So most buildings in the UK have gas-fired boilers. It's how we move those to heat pumps without changing terminal units or actually phasing through a terminal replacement program. And in order to support all of those things, we've kind of put together a raft of services which our clients have been asking for, and they cover anything from the building level, from whole life carbon and operational energy, to portfolio strategies and roadmaps, and then again at corporate level, supply chain charters, carbon neutral certification and footprinting. So I'll just finish with this call to action, which is we've seen the effects of climate change. We're starting to see how they're impacting the built environment with extreme temperatures and flash flooding. The costs of insurance and remedial works is rising and will only get greater over time. So the cost of inaction is now greater than the cost of action. We really need to take action in the next decade and move towards net zero carbon. Thank you. That's the end of the presentation. Do we have any questions, Bianca?
Yes, we do. But I'll probably start because you've said in your presentation about all the commercial buildings, the residential, but I'm sure some of our attendees will wonder about the healthcare buildings and how do we get there?
Sure. What I didn't mention at the beginning is that over the last few months we've done a number of presentations and detailed reviews of our steps to net zero carbon and different built building types. And we recently did an event on healthcare, which is on our YouTube channel, and we've written a paper on it. Healthcare is probably one of the greatest challenges we face because of obvious cost constraints associated with those buildings. The fact that those buildings generally have to maintain operations during the refurbishment works, and they're quite heavily intensely used. So they're used 24 hours a day, quite a lot of those buildings, 7 days a week. They also have high intensity and high control areas. So treatment areas have to be at certain temperatures, have to have certain control. So they become very energy intensive. So it is the greatest challenge. But again, our partner and lead of our healthcare sector, and Stephen Maddox from the Manchester office, actually recently did a roundtable discussion on how we move healthcare towards net zero carbon. It is a big challenge, but the NHS are starting to face that challenge. We've been working with a few trusts now on their net zero carbon strategy, but the starting point for them is really understanding their carbon footprint. Most of them have very little understanding of their scope 1 and 2 emissions, let alone their scope 3 emissions. And there are quicker wins than some of their buildings. So it's going to be a long-term approach, but all areas of the estate needs to be decarbonised.
Thank you. Looking at the benchmark data you did for GLA, a number of the samples seem to have much lower substructure figures and facade figures. Were there commonalities across these designs with low carbon figures? Superstructure seems to be the big number across all 50 projects. Are Cundall focusing on alternative structural solutions to reduce carbon?
Good question. Again, the studies we looked at for the GLA were collated from the industry, so some of them actually included refurbishment, but generally where we're looking at new buildings, when we're looking at embodied carbon, the structure and substructure are the majority of the carbon footprint, and in Cundall, my embodied carbon team is working closely with the structural team to put together early stage interventions, so looking at grid spacing, different materials, and how much of an impact they have, so we can give a high level advice at REBA stage 1 and 2 on the impact of material selection and grid spacing and its impact on the carbon footprint. Again, I mentioned earlier the LETI targets and the RIBA challenges targets for embodied carbon. They're exceptionally difficult, and in order to hit the interim targets, you really need to start looking towards hybrid solutions, which includes some form of CLT. And if you want to get down to the lower than 300, 350 target, then you pretty much have to move to a full CLT or timber building, which, given the current climate with health and safety and the fire regulations, is extremely challenging. We are looking at a number of projects using traditional construction, you're just using steel and concrete, and we're able to get close to the 600 target, but it's extremely challenging. And what we're seeing with a number of architects is really a close look at how we look at the grids. So not looking at long spans, looking at standard steel sections. Standard steel sections are a good advantage because you can use arc-fired steel rather than blast-fired steel, which has a much lower carbon footprint. So there's a lot going on in the structural area, and it really needs to be resolved very early on a project, by the absolute latest, the end of REBA stage 2. So you need that early stage intervention and a structural engineer who understands it.
Okay, thank you. How do we get to a point where CLT is a financially viable solution for new buildings outside of London?
So yeah, it's a challenge we're facing on quite a lot of projects, and to be honest, we're trying to work out whether it is always the right solution. At the moment, the projects where we're looking at taller buildings, you're having to add in a lot of complexity around CLT, especially around the fire and acoustic issues, whereas smaller low-rise buildings seem to lend themselves better to CLT. And again, where we're looking at the smaller buildings, there isn't really that much of a cost uplift because you get a saving in the foundation because it's lighter, and potentially build time and program. So if CLT is used correctly on certain building types, it can be cost neutral. It's where you're trying to force it into high-rise buildings which have more stringent requirements from, say, the BCO, that it becomes problematic. And that might not be the solution in the end, unless we can move towards more standardized off-site construction, where we can basically drop in CLT flooring modules which are already made to the acoustic and fire regulations and pre-tested. because again, the testing and fire regulations is the major hurdle at the moment.
Okay, thank you. And finally, it's not a question related necessarily to this webinar, but I think this one is addressed to you, Paul. What engineering services in the office market are you seeing a demand for in response to COVID-19?
Well, much of it, I think, relates to the ventilation, understandably, because we're trying to avoid having recirculated air. So, yeah, we're having to look at things like thermal wheels on heat recovery for the ventilation systems that might pass germs between the supply and the extract. Then we're looking at things like smart buildings. So a lot of the new offices that we're looking at now, we're looking to introduce systems that make touchless access with the access controls and be able to use apps on your phone to call lifts and things like this. So yeah, there have been some changes to what we're having to look at on the engineering systems. But I mean, common sense, I think, has to apply, and just keeping apart from people and wearing masks and stuff is probably going to have a greater impact than spending lots of money on your ventilation system.
We have heard incidents where people have been going in and installing filters to filter the outside air, which is basically putting significant pressure on the AHUs, and then they're not able to provide minimum fresh air. The most important thing from CIBSE and ASHRAE is dilution. So it's all about airflow. The outside air is an issue, but it's not as big an issue as removing pollutants inside. So anything that compromises airflow, you shouldn't consider.
I would add, we have done a piece of work that identifies some of the options for the COVID-19 sort of design solutions and had them costed with a QS. So happy to share that with anyone who's interested after the seminar. If we get their email details, Bianca.
Yeah, sure.
Also on the Cundall website, there is a full list of services. So we're helping quite a lot of organisations reoccupy their buildings, including the Ministry of Justice. We're going through all their buildings at the moment, looking at solutions for reoccupation of those buildings.
The problem is there's a conflict in there between what we just talked about and COVID-19 increasing fresh air and as an energy downside, unfortunately. So
it's the compromise we've been discussing so the last 4 or 5 years has been a focus on health and well-being and how we design for health and well-being without penalising energy consumption. And the same is true with COVID. A lot of the COVID response items are hopefully short-term, so running ventilation 24 hours a day, bypassing thermal wheels. Hopefully that won't need to be done in the future, but in the future it's going to be about the ability to rapidly dilute spaces. So again, it comes back to not sealing the buildings, having natural ventilation openings, which aids net zero carbon as well. So it's looking for those solutions which are able to aid health and well-being whilst also aiding viral control and air quality.
Okay, one more question actually. What provisions are being made in legislations for the design and build market, as value engineering, reducing the cost of install, seems to be always the most important part of the project?
It's a good question. As Paul alluded to earlier, the drivers for change are really ratcheting up at the moment. So the government are reviewing the building regulations. So my partner, Alan Fogarty, is on the chair of the non-domestic review of the building regulations at the moment. And the domestic regulations have come out for consultation, which is a good step change. It's not enough, but it's definitely a move in the right direction. The non-domestic is stalled slightly because the government have been preoccupied with COVID and Brexit, but before we went into lockdown, it was being talked about quite considerably, and they were making the right noises. So the regulations will be updated within the next year, and we'll have a lot more teeth. But what's more interesting to me is what we're looking at with bays. So we're looking at copying the New York model, which is basically to have mandatory requirements for operational energy in use. So all buildings will have a maximum energy intensity threshold. And if they exceed that threshold, there will be a financial penalty associated with that building. In order for Manchester to hit its 2038 target, they will definitely need to introduce something like that. So there needs to be stick and carrot. So again, as we move towards people's carbon targets, especially the local authorities, they're really going to have to ratchet up their measures in order to hit those targets. The UK government's 2050 target is challenging. Anyone who's set one before then is really going to have to look at what they're doing. I know I've been speaking to Manchester, they're thinking about a whole range of interesting measures coming forward, which will really start to have a financial implication. But the biggest driver, as Paul indicated at the moment, is the finance. So yes, you might be able to value engineer and build the building a bit cheaper, but then who are you going to sell it to, or who are you going to let it to? So I'm working with one developer who sell, I think, about 50–60% of their buildings to one hedge fund. That hedge fund now require all the buildings that they purchase to meet specific climate change mitigation adaptation measures as part of their corporate social responsibility. So in order for that developer now to sell to that landlord, they have to meet their stringent requirements. And again, we're working with a number of landlords who have tenants now coming to them saying, where is the pathway to net zero carbon for this building? If you do not have one, we can't meet our net zero carbon targets and we're going to move out. So yes, you might be able to build a building considerably cheaper, but what is the asset value of that? And will anyone want to rent it or occupy it going forward?
Okay. I think that's all for the questions. So thank you very much for everyone that attended our Triage for an Ailing Planet webinar. As I mentioned before, this webinar has been recorded and it will be posted on YouTube channel. Paul, do you have anything to add?
I only to thank everyone for attending. It's also the Green Summit in Manchester this week. So we're very pleased that you've chosen to choose our webinar over all of the many activities that are going on with Manchester City Council this week. There's a number of really interesting topics on there, so I'd encourage people, if you're interested in this subject, to join, sign up to that as well. It goes on through till Thursday evening. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.